It was one of those warm Saturday afternoons when everyone seemed to be out running errands at the same time. The grocery store parking lot was packed, and cars circled around, waiting for someone to pull out. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and hot asphalt, and the sound of shopping carts rattling against the pavement mixed with the hum of engines. Among the crowd was a tall, calm-looking man in his mid-30s. He wore a plain gray t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His truck was clean but modest. Nothing flashy, just practical. He'd come straight from visiting his mother, who wasn't in the best health, and he needed to grab a few things before heading home. He spotted an open parking space near the store entrance. It was a handicapped spot, but his tag hung clearly from the rearview mirror. He had earned that tag, not from age or laziness, but from years of service that left him with injuries not visible to the eye. He turned smoothly into the spot, parked, and sat for a moment checking his phone before getting out. As he stepped out, a car came speeding down the aisle and screeched to a stop behind him. A loud horn blared, and he turned, confused, to see a middle-aged couple inside a shiny white SUV. The woman in the passenger seat was waving her hands wildly, and the man behind the wheel looked red-faced and angry. He didn't understand what the problem was. Maybe they wanted the spot? He gestured politely, as if to ask, "Is everything all right?" But instead of a calm response, the man threw open his door and stormed out. His wife followed close behind, muttering under her breath. The man pointed at the truck and shouted, "You can't park there. That's a handicapped spot." The shopper blinked in surprise. He spoke calmly, his voice steady. "I have the tag right there," he said, nodding toward the blue placard on his mirror. The man scoffed and waved his hand. "Yeah, right, you look fine to me. You people always think you can just take whatever you want." The words hit harder than they should have. He wasn't the type to react to insults, especially not in public. He took a slow breath the way he'd been trained, steady, patient, in control. "Sir," he said evenly, "I have every right to park here. If you have an issue, you can call the store or the police. But please don't raise your voice." By now, other shoppers were starting to notice. A woman pushing a cart full of groceries paused a few feet away. A young man near the entrance took out his phone, sensing trouble brewing. The man's wife crossed her arms. "Unbelievable," she said loudly. "You're not disabled. You're just one of those scammers. Probably borrowed that tag from someone else." He shook his head and tried to walk away. He didn't want a scene, especially not in a place full of families. But the couple followed, their voices getting louder. He reached the back of his truck, grabbed a small reusable bag, and turned toward the store. That's when the man blocked his path. "I said move your truck," the man shouted. "Sir," he said again, this time firmer. "Please let me pass." The man leaned closer, his face tight with anger. "Don't talk to me like that," he growled. "I saw you walk just fine. There's nothing wrong with you. People like you make it harder for real disabled folks." He could smell alcohol on the man's breath, faint but noticeable. The woman, meanwhile, pulled out her phone and started recording. "Let's see how tough he acts when everyone online sees what he's doing," she said with a smirk. He felt the frustration rising inside him, but forced himself to stay composed. "You're free to record," he said quietly. "I've done nothing wrong," the man sneered. "You think you can just hide behind that uniform of yours?" That stopped him. He hadn't mentioned his military service. It wasn't on his clothes, not on his car. The man must have seen the small veteran plate on his license. He took a step back, still calm. "I'm not hiding behind anything. I just want to buy my groceries and leave." By now, more people had stopped to watch. Some shook their heads. Others whispered. A few took out their phones too. The couple didn't seem to care. They seemed to enjoy the attention. The woman laughed loudly. "Oh, don't play the hero. You think because you're some big tough guy you can take whatever spot you want?" He looked at her, his eyes steady but tired. "Ma'am, I don't want any trouble." The man stepped forward again, pointing a finger right at his chest. "You're lucky my wife's recording, or I'd—" He didn't finish. The shopper raised his hand slightly, not in aggression but as a warning. "That's enough," he said quietly. "Please, step back." The tone in his voice made a few bystanders shift uncomfortably. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Years of discipline gave it that edge, calm, certain, and firm. The man hesitated for a second, then scoffed again. "You threatening me?" "No," he replied. "I'm asking you to stop." But the couple wasn't done. The woman shouted something about entitlement and special treatment, and the man kept circling him like he was waiting for a reason to explode. One of the store employees, a young kid in a green apron, came out holding a small cart of baskets. He looked nervous but approached anyway. "Hey, sir," he said carefully to the angry man. "Please, you can't yell at customers like this." The man snapped around. "Mind your business, kid. This guy's breaking the law." The employee looked at the truck, saw the valid tag, then back at the man. "Sir, he's allowed to park there," the worker said softly. "Please calm down." That only made things worse. The woman scoffed loudly. "Unbelievable, everyone's on his side because of what he looks like. Typical." The shopper could feel every eye in the parking lot on them now. His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't move closer or raise his voice. He just stood there, still and patient. A man from a few cars down took out his phone. "I'm calling the police," he said loudly. "This has gone too far." That finally made the couple pause, but only for a second. The man laughed. "Go ahead, call them. Let's see what they say when they find out he's lying." The shopper sighed quietly. He knew how these things could spiral. He took a small step to the side, trying once again to walk toward the store entrance. But as he did, the woman moved in front of him, holding her phone high. "Don't you walk away," she said, her voice sharp. "You think you can just do whatever you want?" He didn't reply. He'd learned long ago that sometimes silence said more than words. The man suddenly grabbed at the shopping bag in his hand, trying to yank it away. It was such a quick, pointless gesture that even the woman looked surprised. The bag tore slightly, spilling a few items onto the ground. He stepped back immediately, raising both hands. "That's enough," he said again, his voice calm, but commanding. The woman gasped dramatically as if she'd been attacked. "Did you see that?" she shouted to no one in particular. "He almost hit me." A few people groaned. Someone said loudly, "Lady, that's not what happened." Another voice added, "It's all on camera. Yours and ours." The couple froze for a moment. The man looked around, realizing half a dozen phones were now pointed at them. The woman lowered hers slightly, her confidence flickering. The shopper bent down slowly, picked up his fallen items, and placed them back into the torn bag. "I'm going inside now," he said softly. He walked past them without another word. The man muttered something under his breath but didn't follow this time. As he reached the doors, he heard a woman nearby whisper, "Some people just don't know when to stop." Another replied, "He handled that better than I ever could." Inside the store, the cool air was a relief after the heat outside. He took a slow breath, trying to shake off the tension. He'd dealt with worse, far worse, but something about the scene bothered him. Not the shouting, not the false accusations, but how quickly strangers had decided who he was before they even spoke to him. He pushed his cart through the aisles, focused on his list: milk, bread, fruit, a few things for his mother. But even as he moved through the store, he could still hear echoes of the confrontation outside. Meanwhile, in the parking lot, the couple stood by their SUV, still fuming. The woman was muttering about how people get away with everything these days, while the man checked his phone, probably scrolling through the video he thought made him look righteous. But the truth was already slipping from their control. Several bystanders had caught the whole thing from start to finish, the yelling, the insults, even the moment the man tried to grab the bag. A few minutes later, 2 police cars quietly pulled into the lot. They hadn't been called for violence, just a disturbance. But the moment they arrived, a few shoppers waved them down. The couple straightened up as the officers approached. "Finally," the woman exclaimed, "we need to report someone abusing a handicap spot." The officers listened patiently, but before they could finish, another shopper stepped forward. "That's not what happened," he said firmly. "They started yelling at him for no reason. I've got it on video." The woman's smile faltered. "You don't know what you saw," she snapped. The officer raised a hand. "Ma'am, please stay calm. We'll take everyone's statements." Inside, the shopper had finished checking out. As he loaded his groceries into the bag, the cashier, a kind-faced woman, gave him a sympathetic look. "I saw what happened outside," she said softly. "You handled that really well." He offered a small smile. "Just trying to stay calm," he replied. She nodded. "People can be cruel for no reason. Don't let it ruin your day." He thanked her, took his receipt, and headed toward the exit. As he stepped outside, he noticed the 2 patrol cars and the small crowd still lingering by his truck. He sighed quietly, not from fear but from weariness. He'd hoped it would be over by now. One of the officers spotted him and approached. "Sir, are you the owner of that truck?" "Yes, officer," he said, keeping his voice even. "What's going on?" "We just got a call about an argument," the officer explained. "Mind if I ask what happened?" He nodded and calmly told the story from the beginning, how he'd parked with a valid tag, how the couple had confronted him, and how he'd tried to walk away. The officer listened carefully, taking notes. A few witnesses chimed in, confirming everything he said. One even showed the officer a video. The second officer walked back toward the couple, who were now noticeably quieter. The woman's arms were crossed tightly, her earlier confidence gone. After a few minutes, the officer returned. "All right, sir," he said, "you're good to go. Sorry you had to deal with that." He nodded in appreciation. "Thank you, officer." The officer smiled faintly. "You handled yourself with a lot of restraint. Most people wouldn't have." He didn't say much to that, just gave a polite nod. "I've had some practice," he said quietly. As he placed his bags into the truck, he could hear the officers still talking to the couple behind him. The words were muffled, but the tone was clear. The couple was being told to calm down and leave the premises. He started his truck, adjusted the mirror, and looked at the reflection of the store behind him. The crowd had begun to disperse. The heat shimmered off the pavement again, and for a moment, everything seemed to return to normal. He backed out slowly, not in a rush, not angry, just ready to leave the noise behind. As he drove off, the officer glanced back at the couple, shaking his head slightly. "People really need to learn some manners," he said to his partner. The partner nodded. "Karma has a way of handling that," he replied. And in that moment, the calm man behind the wheel couldn't help but agree. He didn't know it yet. But the next few minutes would prove just how right that officer was. The air inside the truck felt cooler than before, but his chest was still tight from the tension of what had just happened. He gripped the steering wheel lightly, took a deep breath, and exhaled slowly. Moments like that always reminded him that the world could change so fast. One second you're running errands. The next you're the center of unwanted attention. He turned on the radio just for some background noise, not really listening to the music. As he drove down the road, he tried to push the whole thing out of his mind. But it lingered, not because of the insults or shouting, but because of how natural it had seemed for those 2 people to judge someone they didn't even know. It was like they carried their anger around, just waiting for a target. Traffic moved slowly near the main intersection. The grocery store was less than a mile behind him now, but the stress still sat heavy in his chest. He turned right, deciding to stop by a small coffee shop he liked. Quiet, family-owned, and always calm. Maybe a cup of coffee would help him settle his thoughts before heading home. The bell above the door chimed as he walked in. The smell of roasted beans and baked pastries filled the air, soft music playing in the background. The barista behind the counter, a cheerful young woman with a welcoming smile, greeted him. "Hey there, what can I get for you today?" "Just a black coffee, please," he said with a small smile. She nodded. "Sure thing. It'll just be a minute." He found a seat near the window, away from the few other customers inside. From where he sat, he could see out into the small parking lot. He liked this spot because it was quiet, unbothered, peaceful, exactly what he needed after what happened. As he sat there, he took out his phone and checked his messages. A few texts from friends, one from his mom asking if he'd made it home yet. He typed a quick reply that he was fine and would stop by again tomorrow. The coffee arrived, and he thanked the barista. The first sip was hot but grounding. He looked out the window at the steady rhythm of passing cars and thought about how quickly things could turn ugly, for no reason at all. He'd seen people lose control before, overseas, in high-stress situations where emotions could mean life or death. But this was different. This was supposed to be home, safe, predictable. Yet people still found reasons to hate, to lash out, to assume the worst. He shook his head, trying to clear the thought. Not everyone was like that, he reminded himself. The people who stepped up to tell the truth outside, they proved that kindness still existed. He finished his coffee slowly, letting the warmth ease the tension in his shoulders. When he finally stood up to leave, the barista smiled again. "Hope your day gets better," she said kindly. "It already has," he replied, meaning it. Outside, the sun had started to dip lower, painting the sky in soft shades of orange. He walked toward his truck, feeling a little lighter. But as he opened the door, he noticed something that made him stop. Across the street, parked in a small lot near a fast food restaurant, was a familiar white SUV. His stomach sank. He recognized the shiny chrome trim, the bumper sticker, the same one that had been behind him at the grocery store. At first, he thought maybe it was just a coincidence. There were lots of white SUVs in town. But then he saw the man from earlier, pacing outside the restaurant, phone in hand, looking angry again. The woman was in the passenger seat watching him through the window. He sighed quietly. He didn't want another encounter. Maybe they hadn't seen him. He decided to take the long way home, circling around the block. But as he turned the corner, he caught sight of the SUV pulling out, heading in his direction. He tried not to assume the worst. Maybe they were just leaving too. But when he reached the next stoplight and looked in his mirror, the same SUV was 2 cars behind him. He didn't speed up. He didn't slow down. He just drove normally. But with every turn, every change of lane, the white SUV followed. The calm he'd felt at the coffee shop started to fade. His training told him to stay alert, not paranoid, but his instincts were sharp. Something didn't feel right. After a few blocks, he turned onto a quieter street leading toward a gas station. If they followed him there, he'd know it wasn't coincidence. Sure enough, when he pulled into the station and stopped near one of the pumps, the SUV slowed, then pulled into the same lot. He turned off his engine, stepped out calmly, and pretended to check his tire. He could see the man still in the driver's seat, glaring at him through the windshield. The woman was saying something, waving her hands. He took out his phone and opened the camera just in case. Then, without looking directly at them, he walked toward the store entrance. Inside, the cashier, an older man with kind eyes, greeted him. "Evening," the cashier said. "Evening," he replied, nodding politely.
"Can I get a bottle of water, please?"
As he paid, he looked out the window. The SUV was still there, parked crookedly near the entrance. The man was on the phone again, pacing by the hood. The cashier noticed. "You know those folks?" He shook his head. "No, but they seem to think they know me." The cashier frowned. "They giving you trouble?" "Not yet," he said quietly. "But they might." The older man nodded, then reached under the counter and pressed a small button that triggered the store's camera system to record. "Don't worry," he said. "We've got plenty of eyes around here." He appreciated that. He stood near the window, sipping his water, pretending not to notice the man staring at him. After a few minutes, the man finally got back into the SUV. It didn't leave, though. The engine stayed running, headlights glowing. The shopper stayed calm, standing his ground. He wasn't going to run. If anything, he wanted to give them no excuse to twist the story again. The SUV inched forward slowly, then stopped again. The man rolled down his window halfway and shouted across the parking lot, "You think you can get away with that?" A few people nearby looked up from their cars. The cashier leaned closer to the window, watching carefully. The shopper didn't respond. He just stood there, still holding his bottle of water. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone." The man shouted again. He still didn't answer. "Yeah, keep pretending you're the good guy," the man said, his voice rising. "People like you always get what's coming." The shopper exhaled slowly. He wasn't scared, just disappointed. The woman in the passenger seat was recording again, pointing her phone straight at him. He decided not to say anything. Instead, he turned, walked back into the store, and told the cashier softly, "Might be a good idea to call the police again." "They're following me." The cashier nodded and picked up the phone immediately. Outside, the man was still shouting, but now other people were starting to record him too. One driver honked his horn in annoyance, shouting, "Hey, leave him alone." The man turned his anger toward that driver, yelling something back, and in that split second, he stopped paying attention to what he was doing. His SUV started to roll forward, inching toward the pump. The shopper saw it happen. He stepped back, watching as the front bumper tapped against the metal pole near the pump. It wasn't hard enough to cause major damage, but the sound made everyone in the lot turn. The man cursed loudly and slammed the gear into park. The woman shouted at him for not paying attention. The shopper stayed inside, quietly sipping his water, while the cashier chuckled softly. "Karma works fast sometimes," the old man muttered. Within minutes, a patrol car pulled in. The same officer from earlier stepped out. His eyebrows lifted slightly when he recognized the man inside the store. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon," the officer said. "Didn't expect to be followed," the shopper replied, calmly. The officer nodded and stepped back outside, walking over to the SUV. The couple immediately started talking, loud, defensive, each trying to speak over the other. The officer held up a hand. "One at a time," he said firmly. "Why are you following this man?" The man's voice shook with anger. He attacked us earlier. We wanted to make sure he didn't get away with it." The officer frowned. "I already saw the videos from the store parking lot. He didn't attack you." The woman crossed her arms tightly. "That's not what we saw!" "Well, it's what the camera saw," the officer replied. "And now you're following him around town. That's harassment." The man's face went pale. "We weren't harassing. We just happened to be going the same way." The officer gestured toward the gas station. "You followed him here. Multiple witnesses saw it." The shopper stood quietly by the door, not saying a word. The cashier came over and stood beside him, arms folded. The officer spoke again, his tone calm but firm. "I'm going to ask you both to leave right now. If you continue following him, we'll have to take further action." The man opened his mouth to argue, but the officer cut him off. "Enough. Get in your car and go home." The couple hesitated, then the woman huffed, muttering something about unfair treatment, before they finally backed out of the lot. The SUV sped off, tires squealing slightly as it turned the corner. The officer watched them leave, then turned back to the shopper. "You okay?" He nodded slowly. "I'm fine. Just tired." The officer nodded. "They won't bother you again. But if they do, call us immediately." "Appreciate it," he said quietly. The officer smiled faintly. "You seem like the type who doesn't look for trouble, but trouble still finds you." He gave a small laugh. "Something like that." The officer tipped his cap. "You handled that with a lot of patience. Most people would have lost it." When the patrol car left, the cashier turned to him with a grin. "Guess you've got angels watching over you today." He smiled. "Or maybe just good timing." He walked back out to his truck, finally feeling a sense of peace returning. The sunset had deepened, streaks of red and purple stretching across the horizon. The day had been long, but he was finally ready to go home. As he pulled out of the gas station, he thought about how strange life could be, how people could twist reality so easily when blinded by anger. But he also thought about the kindness he'd seen in strangers, the cashier, the bystanders, even the officer who took the time to listen. The road ahead was quiet. The hum of the engine filled the silence as the city lights flickered on one by one. He rolled down the window slightly, letting the cool evening air wash over him. He wasn't angry anymore, just thoughtful. He knew the world had its share of people like that couple, loud, bitter, full of misplaced rage. But he also knew that no amount of hate could change who he was or what he stood for, and somewhere in that thought he found calm again. Back in town, the couple's SUV turned into a small side street. The man slammed the steering wheel, muttering under his breath. He was frustrated not only because things hadn't gone his way, but because deep down he knew he'd crossed a line. The woman tried to comfort him, saying, "Forget it, let's just go home." But before they could, a flashing light appeared in their rearview mirror. Another patrol car. The same officer had seen them run a red light while speeding away from the gas station. The man cursed again. Realizing what was happening, the officer stepped out, hand on his flashlight, and said, "Evening again." "License and registration." The man sighed heavily, defeated. Sometimes, karma didn't take long at all. The flashing red and blue lights filled the quiet street, bouncing off windows and fences as the white SUV came to a stop. The man gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale, while the woman beside him muttered in frustration. What had started as a simple argument over a parking spot had now turned into something much bigger than either of them expected. The officer walked slowly toward the car. His steps were calm, but his expression was serious. He had dealt with people like this before, loud when they thought they were right, silent when they realized they'd gone too far. He asked for their licenses and registrations without raising his voice. The couple obeyed, their earlier bravado fading into nervous silence. "You were speeding," the officer said, "and you ran a red light. Any reason for that?" The man opened his mouth, then closed it again. "We were just trying to get home," he finally muttered. The officer glanced at the woman. "Ma'am, were you recording again just now?" She hesitated, holding her phone tightly. I was just documenting what happened earlier," she said quietly. "Well," the officer replied, "you might want to document this too, because speeding and reckless driving could have hurt someone." The man groaned under his breath. The officer didn't argue or scold. He just finished writing the citation, handed it over, and said, "Drive safely. And stop following people around. It's not worth the trouble." The man nodded stiffly. The woman mumbled something that sounded like agreement, but her eyes were full of resentment. The officer waited until they pulled away, then sighed softly. He'd seen people make mistakes before, but rarely did they learn from them right away. Still, he hoped this would be enough of a wake-up call. Meanwhile, across town, the man in the truck was finally pulling into his driveway. The house was modest, a single-story home with a small front yard and an old oak tree that shaded the porch. As he parked, the motion light flicked on, bathing the driveway in a warm glow. He turned off the engine and sat there for a moment. The day had been long, heavier than it should have been. What should have been a quick grocery run had turned into a chain of exhausting encounters. He leaned his head back against the seat, staring at the ceiling for a few seconds, just breathing. Finally, he grabbed the bags from the passenger seat and walked toward the door. The sound of crickets filled the air, and the faint smell of freshly cut grass drifted from a neighbor's yard. Inside, the house was quiet. He placed the groceries on the kitchen counter, then took off his cap and rubbed the back of his neck. The ache in his shoulder flared again, the old injury that never quite healed. It was one of those things people couldn't see, the reason he had that handicap tag in the first place. He poured himself a glass of water and looked out the window. The neighborhood was peaceful. Kids' bikes left on lawns, porch lights glowing softly. It was hard to believe that just an hour earlier, he'd been shouted at in public for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. He didn't hate the couple. He didn't even feel angry anymore. What he felt was tired of how easily people let hate control them. He sat down on the couch and turned on the TV, not to watch anything in particular, just for background noise. A local news segment was playing, the reporter talking about community events and weather updates. Then suddenly a headline flashed across the screen that caught his attention. It read, "Viral video, confrontation in grocery store parking lot sparks debate." His chest tightened. The anchor continued. "A video showing a heated argument between a couple and a disabled veteran has gained thousands of views online. Witnesses say the man remained calm as the couple shouted at him, questioning his right to park in a handicapped space. He froze. He hadn't wanted attention. He hadn't even known anyone had uploaded the video yet. The clip played on the screen. His truck, the angry couple, the shouting, his calm reply. The news station had blurred faces, but it was easy to tell who was who. The anchor went on. Many online users are praising the man's patience and composure, calling him a role model for handling the situation with dignity. He leaned back on the couch, speechless. He never wanted to be a viral story. All he wanted was a quiet life. But as the clip ended, something inside him softened. Maybe, just maybe, people seeing that moment might think twice before judging someone again. His phone buzzed. It was a message from a friend he hadn't spoken to in months. "Hey man, you're on the news. Everyone's talking about how calm you were. You handled that like a pro." He sighed and typed back, "Didn't mean for that to happen." His friend replied, "Maybe not, but it's a good thing. The world needs to see examples like that." He smiled faintly and put his phone down. Maybe his friend was right. Across town, however, the couple's evening was not going as peacefully. They had just gotten home and their phones were blowing up with messages. Friends, co-workers, even relatives were sending them links to the same video that was now all over social media. The woman sat on the couch, scrolling through comments. Her face grew paler with each line she read. "Can you believe these people?" One comment said, "They attacked a veteran for no reason." Another read, This is exactly what's wrong with society. People judging others by how they look. The man walked in from the kitchen, holding a beer, but his hand was shaking slightly. "Turn that off," he muttered. "It's everywhere," she said quietly. "It's on every local page," he cursed under his breath. "They're twisting it." "We didn't do anything wrong." She looked up at him. "We followed him twice, and the police showed up twice. You really think people are going to believe we didn't do anything?" He didn't answer. Instead, he sat down heavily in his chair and ran a hand over his face. The anger he'd carried all day was finally being replaced by something else. Fear. Within an hour, their phones started ringing again. One of his coworkers called, asking if the rumors online were true. Another message popped up from his boss. "We need to talk tomorrow morning." The woman looked at her husband, panic in her eyes. "They're going to fire you," she whispered. He didn't respond. He just stared at the wall, realizing how quickly things had spiraled out of control. Back at the quiet house across town, the man finished putting away the groceries. He looked at his phone again, seeing more notifications, messages of support, comments from strangers thanking him for setting an example. It felt strange, almost surreal, to be praised for something as simple as staying calm. He didn't reply to any of them. He just smiled softly, put the phone face down, and turned off the TV. The fame, the comments, none of that mattered to him. What mattered was that he'd stayed true to himself when it counted. He walked out onto the porch, the cool night air wrapping around him. Crickets sang in the grass, and the faint sound of laughter came from a house down the street. He sat on the steps, breathing in the calm of the evening. He thought about the couple again, not with anger, but with quiet hope. Maybe after everything, they'd finally realize what they'd done wrong. Maybe this would be the moment that changed them. As the night deepened, he stood up and went back inside, leaving the door slightly open to let in the breeze. He turned off the lights and headed to bed, not realizing that the story was already spreading far beyond his small town. By the next morning, the video had been shared by several national outlets. People across the country were commenting, praising his calm response and criticizing the couple's behavior. The grocery store even released a statement thanking customers for stepping in and standing up for what was right. Meanwhile, the couple was dealing with the full weight of their actions. Reporters were calling, asking for their side of the story. The man's workplace issued a statement saying they did not condone discriminatory behavior. By noon, both of them had deleted their social media accounts, overwhelmed by the backlash. The woman sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her coffee. "We shouldn't have followed him," she said quietly. The man didn't answer. He just nodded slowly. For the first time, the anger was gone from his face. What replaced it was regret. "You know," she said softly. He didn't even fight back. Not once, he just walked away. He sighed, staring at his hands. "Makes me feel worse." That night, they didn't argue. They didn't shout. They just sat together in silence, both realizing that sometimes karma doesn't come with thunder or fury. It comes with reflection. Across town, the man in the truck spent his evening visiting his mother again. She smiled when she saw him, her eyes lighting up. "How's my boy?" she asked. He smiled gently. "Just fine, Mom." She looked at him closely, seeing the tiredness in his face. "You've been through something, haven't you?" He chuckled softly. "Just one of those days." She reached out, taking his hand. "You've always had patience. Your father used to say, 'Calm people make the loudest statement without raising their voice.'" He nodded, holding her hand tighter. He was right. They sat like that for a while, the TV playing softly in the background. She didn't ask for details, and he didn't give any. But she knew, as mothers always do, that something important had happened. When he left her house later that night, he felt lighter. The world still had its share of hate and anger, but it also had kindness, decency, and the power to change. Driving home under the stars, he thought about how small moments could ripple into something bigger, how a single act of patience could become a lesson for thousands of people he'd never meet. At a red light, he saw a message pop up on his phone screen from the officer who'd helped earlier. "Just wanted to say, Tid, that video's making a difference. People are learning from it. Take care of yourself." He smiled and replied, "Thank you, officer. Just glad it ended the way it did." When he finally pulled into his driveway again, he turned off the engine and sat there quietly for a moment, looking at the stars above. The world hadn't changed overnight, but maybe, just maybe, a few people had, and that was enough. The next morning began like any other, but the air around town felt different. People had been talking nonstop about the video that had spread across every platform overnight. It wasn't just a local story anymore. It had reached news pages, podcasts, and even morning talk shows. At the diner on Main Street, conversations hummed over coffee and pancakes. A few regulars sat by the window, scrolling through their phones and shaking their heads. "You see this?" one man asked, turning his screen around. "That's our grocery store parking lot. Never thought I'd see it on the news." Another man nodded. "Can you blame him?" He kept calm the whole time. Didn't even raise his voice. A woman at the counter added, "Shows a lot about his character. Most people would have lost it. He just handled it with grace." As they talked, the doorbell jingled and the man they were all talking about quietly walked in. He wasn't there for attention. He just wanted his usual breakfast and a moment of peace. But as soon as he stepped inside, the room seemed to notice. The waitress smiled kindly. "Morning," she said, setting down a menu even though she already knew his order. He smiled back, a little embarrassed. "Morning." He took his usual seat near the back, hoping people would go back to their conversations. But it was clear, and word had spread. Someone approached his table gently, an older gentleman wearing a baseball cap. "Excuse me," the man said, voice soft. "You don't know me, but I just wanted to shake your hand. You handled yourself better than most of us could have." The man at the table nodded modestly, standing to return the handshake. "Thank you, sir. Just tried to stay calm." The older man smiled. "You did more than that. You reminded folks that kindness still counts." After he walked away, others followed. Not to bother or crowd, but to offer a word of respect. One woman said her son had watched the video and learned something important from it. Another man said it made him think about how he reacted when things didn't go his way. By the time his breakfast arrived, he felt both humbled and a little overwhelmed. He never asked to be an example. He just wanted to live quietly. But maybe he thought this was how change started. Not through speeches or headlines, but through small reminders of humanity. While all this was happening, the couple from the parking lot sat at home in a very different mood. The blinds were drawn, and the sound of news chatter filled the room. Their faces were pale, tired from a night without sleep. The man's phone buzzed again, but he didn't pick it up. The woman glanced at him nervously. "You can't ignore it forever," she said. He rubbed his forehead. "I know, I don't even know what to say anymore." On the TV, a reporter discussed the story again, showing clips of the viral moment. Though their faces were blurred, people who knew them had already figured it out. Messages had poured in, some harsh, others simply disappointed. The woman whispered, "It's our fault." The man stayed quiet. He wanted to deny it, to defend himself, but deep down he knew she was right. They hadn't just embarrassed themselves. They had hurt someone who didn't deserve it. Finally, he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. "You know what's crazy?" he said softly. He didn't even yell, not once. "I thought people like him would fight back. But he didn't, he just walked away," she nodded. "And now the whole world's watching." They sat in silence for a while, both lost in thought. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "Maybe we should apologize." He turned, surprised. "To who, the internet? They'd never believe us." "Not to them," she said. "To him," he frowned. The idea made him uncomfortable. "You think he'd even listen?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "But we have to try." For the first time in days, he didn't argue. That afternoon, the man from the diner returned home and sat out on his porch. The autumn air was crisp, the kind that carried the scent of dry leaves and faint wood smoke. He had just finished reading a few letters people had sent. Kind words, mostly from strangers thanking him for being patient. He didn't feel like a hero, but he was grateful that something good had come from a bad moment. As he was sipping his coffee, he noticed a car pull up slowly by the curb. He squinted. It was a white SUV. For a second, his stomach tightened. But then he saw two familiar figures stepping out. The couple. They looked different now, quieter, humbled. The woman was holding something in her hands, and the man's shoulders were slouched. Not out of arrogance this time, but guilt. They stood by the gate, unsure whether to approach. He placed his cup down and stood up. walking toward them calmly. The woman spoke first, her voice trembling slightly. We wanted to say sorry." He didn't say anything right away. He could see the discomfort in their eyes, the weight of what they'd been through since that day. The man cleared his throat. "We were wrong," he said simply. "No excuses. We judged you without reason. We said things we shouldn't have, and we're paying for it now." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening. "You didn't deserve any of it." The man on the porch took a slow breath. "I appreciate you coming here," he said quietly. "That takes courage." They both looked down, clearly unsure what else to say. He continued, "I forgave you the moment I drove away. Holding on to anger doesn't do any good." The woman wiped her eyes. "We didn't expect you to say that," he smiled faintly. "People make mistakes. What matters is whether they learn from them." The man swallowed hard. "We did, believe me, we did." There was a long pause. Birds chirped in the distance. The world seemed softer in that moment. 3 people standing in the same space, connected by a lesson none of them had planned to live through. Finally, the man extended his hand. Apology accepted. The other man looked surprised, then slowly reached out and shook it. The handshake wasn't long, but it was enough. The tension that had filled the air for days seemed to fade. The woman managed a small smile. "Thank you," she whispered. "And we're really sorry," he nodded. "Just treat people better from now on. That's all I ask." They both nodded quickly. "We will," the man said. After they left, he stood there for a moment, watching the car disappear down the street. He felt lighter, not because they had apologized, but because they had faced the truth. That mattered more than anything else. That night, he went for a quiet walk around the neighborhood. The stars were bright above him, and a soft wind rustled the trees. As he walked, a few people waved, some calling out words of encouragement. One neighbor stepped out of his yard and said, "Hey, saw that news piece about you. You handled it like a gentleman." He smiled humbly. "Thank you. Just did what felt right." "You did more than that," the neighbor said. "You reminded folks what respect looks like." He nodded, feeling grateful for the kindness around him. Meanwhile, the couple returned home after their visit, sitting quietly in their car for a few minutes before going inside. The woman leaned back in her seat. "I feel different," she said softly. The man nodded slowly. "So do I." "It's weird," she continued. "You spend your whole life thinking you're right about everything, and then one moment shows you how wrong you can be." He let out a deep breath. "Yeah, and the worst part is realizing it too late." She looked out the window, watching the streetlights flicker. "At least we said sorry." He nodded again. "Yeah, maybe that's a start." Inside, they sat on the couch in silence. The TV was off, and for once the house felt calm. No shouting, no tension, just quiet understanding. After a few minutes, the woman picked up her phone. "Maybe we should post something," she said. "Not to defend ourselves, just to admit what we did." He looked hesitant. "You think people will care?" "Maybe not," she said, "but maybe it'll show that we learned something." He thought for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, let's do it." That night, they shared a short message online. "We made a mistake. We judged someone unfairly and acted out of ignorance. We've since met him and apologized in person. We're learning, and we hope others learn from our mistake too." The comments that followed were mixed, some skeptical, others supportive. But at least for the first time, the couple wasn't hiding behind excuses. They were facing what they had done. Across town, the man from the video saw their post later that night. He read it quietly, nodded once, and turned off his phone. He didn't need to respond. The world could decide what it wanted to believe. He had already made peace. The next few days passed peacefully. The news cycle moved on as it always did. New stories took over. New discussions filled the airwaves. But for the people involved, that single encounter had changed something deep inside. The man in the truck continued living his quiet life. He went fishing on weekends, volunteered at a local center, and kept checking in on his mother. Every once in a while, someone would recognize him and thank him, but he never let it go to his head. He'd smile and say, "Just trying to do the right thing." The couple, on the other hand, started making small changes. They volunteered at a local community event, donated to a veterans program, and tried to be kinder in everyday life. The man began holding doors open for strangers, not because he had to, but because it reminded him of humility. The woman started talking to people she used to avoid, realizing how limited her world had been before. Life didn't become perfect overnight, but it became better, a little more honest, a little more human. And though they would never erase what happened, they learned that redemption didn't come from pretending it never did. It came from acknowledging it and doing better next time. One evening, months later, the man in the truck sat by the lake near the edge of town. The sun was setting, turning the water gold and orange. He watched the reflection ripple across the surface, calm and endless. He thought about everything that had happened, the anger, the attention, the forgiveness. It all seemed distant now, like a story that had happened to someone else. But one thought remained clear. Kindness wasn't weakness and patience wasn't silence. They were choices. Choices that could change the course of a moment, or even a life. He smiled to himself, tossed a small pebble into the lake, and watched the ripples spread outward, soft, steady, and endless. Just like the lesson that had begun in a parking lot and now lived quietly in the hearts of those who'd lived it. Weeks turned into months, and life in the small town slowly returned to its calm rhythm. The headlines had faded, the online noise had quieted, and the people involved in that once viral story were quietly living their lives again. But something had changed, not in the noise of social media, but in the hearts of those who had experienced it. The man in the truck had found peace again. His days were simple. Morning jogs by the lake, helping at the local community center, visiting his mother every Sunday. Sometimes people still recognized him, but most days he blended right back into the easy pace of small-town life. He didn't think much about that day anymore. It had become a distant memory, a lesson tucked away in the corners of his mind. What mattered now was how he used it, how he treated people, how he kept his calm, and how he continued to live by the values that had guided him through the chaos. One afternoon, as he was cleaning out his truck, he found the small paper tag that had once hung on his mirror, the one that had started everything. The blue and white handicapped tag, slightly bent at the corner. He smiled quietly to himself, remembering how much pain that simple piece of plastic had caused that day, not because of what it was, but because of what people had assumed it meant. He placed it back carefully, running his fingers over the numbers printed on it. To anyone else, it was just a tag, but to him it was a reminder of resilience, of patience, of choosing calm when the world tested him. Later that day, he stopped by the community center. A group of teenagers were cleaning up the park outside, part of a volunteer project. The center's coordinator called him over. "Hey," she said warmly, "you have a minute?" These kids could use a little pep talk. "They've been dragging their feet all morning," he chuckled. "I'm not much of a speech maker." "Just tell them something from your life," she said. "You're good at that." He thought for a moment, then nodded. The kids gathered around him, some sitting on the steps, others leaning against the fence. They looked half interested, half bored, the way teenagers often do. He smiled and said, "You ever have one of those days when everything goes wrong? When someone says something rude, or you get blamed for something you didn't do?" A few nodded. "Well," he continued, "I had one of those days a while back. It could have gone bad, real bad, but instead of yelling, instead of fighting, I just stayed calm. I walked away, and that decision changed a lot more than I expected." The kids listened more closely now. "See," he said, "you don't always get to choose how people treat you, but you do get to choose how you respond. That's what really shows who you are." There was a long pause, then one of the kids raised his hand. "Did it make things better?" He smiled softly. "Not right away, but eventually, yes. Because staying calm doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're strong enough to keep control of yourself when others lose theirs." The kids nodded quietly, some smiling, some thoughtful. When he finished, they clapped softly, and one of them said, "That's actually good advice, sir." He chuckled. "Glad to hear it." As he walked away, the coordinator patted him on the shoulder. "You've got a gift," she said. He smiled. "Just trying to share what I've learned." That night after dinner, he sat on his porch again, watching the sunset fade into soft blues and golds. The world felt peaceful, the kind of quiet that fills you from the inside. He thought about the couple again. He hadn't heard from them since the day they apologized, but that was fine. He hoped they were doing better, that they had found their own peace too. Somewhere across town they were. The couple had slowly rebuilt their lives. After months of reflection, they began volunteering at the same community center, quietly, without fanfare. They helped organize food drives, collected clothes for shelters, and worked on projects that brought people together. The man who used to get frustrated easily had learned to listen more. The woman who once reacted quickly had learned to pause and think before speaking. They never forgot what they'd done, but instead of letting it define them, they used it as a reminder of who they didn't want to be anymore. One Saturday morning, while setting up a booth for a local charity event, the woman looked up and froze for a second. Across the park, she saw the man in the truck, the same man whose patience had changed everything. He was helping carry boxes for another volunteer group. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and he gave a small nod. She smiled, not with guilt this time, but with quiet respect. Later, she gathered the courage to walk over. "Good to see you again," she said softly. He turned, smiling. "Good to see you too. How's everything?" "Better," she said. "We've been volunteering here for a while now. Trying to do something good?" He nodded approvingly. "That's good to hear." She hesitated, then added, "I never got to thank you properly, not just for forgiving us, but for showing us what real strength looks like." He smiled. "You don't owe me thanks. Just keep doing what you're doing," she nodded. "We will." They didn't talk long. Just a few words exchanged between people who had lived through a shared mistake, both changed by it in different ways. But when she walked away, she felt lighter, as if the last piece of guilt had finally lifted. Later, as the event continued, laughter filled the park. Families enjoyed the sunshine, kids ran around, and people from all walks of life worked side by side. It was simple but beautiful, a reminder that even after division and misunderstanding, people could still come together. The man in the truck stood by the table, handing out supplies, smiling as he watched everyone. It wasn't fame or recognition that made him happy. It was seeing people being kind to one another. As the sun dipped low, he looked up and saw the sky turning orange again. It reminded him of that evening months ago when he'd watched the same sunset, wondering if the world would ever change. And now he realized it had. Maybe not everywhere, but in this small corner of the world, in these few hearts, it had. Later that week, a local reporter reached out again. She was doing a follow-up story. Not about controversy this time, but about community healing. She wanted to highlight how something that started with anger had turned into something positive. He wasn't sure he wanted to do it at first. He didn't like the attention. But after thinking it over, he agreed, as long as it wasn't about him alone. It had to be about everyone who had grown from it. The article came out the following week, titled, "From Conflict to Compassion, How One Small Town Learned the Power of Forgiveness." It told the full story, the argument, the viral video, the apology, and the quiet work that followed. The piece ended with a quote from him, "We all make mistakes. What matters most is what we do after them." Kindness isn't just about being nice. It's about being strong enough to let go. The story spread again, but this time it didn't spark outrage. It sparked hope. People shared it with messages about second chances, empathy, and understanding. For the man in the truck, life went on as usual. He still shopped at the same store, parked in the same space, and still wore the same quiet smile. The world hadn't changed overnight, but the people around him had learned something valuable, to see others as human first, and for the couple, the lesson stayed with them too. They became more involved in their town, eventually helping to organize a yearly community unity event, a day dedicated to kindness and understanding among neighbors. They never talked publicly about what had started their journey, but everyone who knew them could see the difference in how they carried themselves. One afternoon, a young man at the event came up to them and said, "I've heard your story. It made me think twice before judging people." "Thank you," the man smiled softly. "That means more than you know." By the time the next year rolled around, the small town had turned that once awkward parking lot into something new. A small plaque was placed near one of the benches, engraved with simple words, "Kindness begins where judgment ends." The man in the truck visited it quietly one morning. He stood there for a moment, reading the words, feeling the cool air against his face. He smiled, not because it was about him, but because the message had taken root. He sat down on the bench for a while, watching cars come and go. People parked, greeted each other, helped one another carry groceries, small acts of decency that most would overlook, but that meant everything in their simplicity. As he sat there, a little boy nearby asked his mother, "Mom, what does that sign mean?" The mother smiled and said, "It means we should be kind before we decide who's right." The boy nodded thoughtfully. "That's good." The man smiled again, hearing that, and quietly stood to leave. Life had a way of moving on, but the lessons stayed, woven into the fabric of everyday moments, quiet reminders that people could change, that forgiveness could heal, and that sometimes the best way to teach the world was by living the example yourself. As he walked toward his truck, the sun rose higher, warm light spreading over the parking lot, the same place where it had all begun, but now filled with peace. He placed his hand on the door, took one last look at the small plaque, and smiled. Then he got in, started the engine, and drove off down the road, calm, steady, and content. Because in the end, it wasn't just about what had happened that day. It was about what came after. It was about growth. It was about forgiveness. It was about the quiet power of choosing kindness when the world expected anger. And sometimes, that choice, small as it seems, is what changes everything. Months had passed since that small town had found its calm again. The story that once stirred the internet was no longer trending, and the people involved had quietly settled back into their daily lives. But even though the noise had faded, the lessons had stayed, quietly shaping hearts, habits, and the way people looked at each other. The man in the truck had returned to his ordinary routines. He still went to the grocery store on weekends, still helped his neighbors fix small things, and still stopped by the lake in the evenings to watch the sunset. But something inside him had changed, not in a dramatic way, but in the simple way someone changes when they've seen both the worst and best sides of people. He noticed more now, the small acts of kindness that used to blend into the background. A teenager helping an older man load groceries, a neighbor mowing someone's lawn without being asked, a cashier offering a kind word to a tired customer. He realized that goodness wasn't loud, but it was everywhere if you looked closely enough. One day, as he was leaving the community center, the coordinator stopped him. "Hey," she said, smiling, "there's someone here who wants to meet you." He turned curious and saw a young man standing near the doorway holding a camera. He looked nervous but excited. "Hi," the young man said quickly. "I'm doing a school project on stories that changed people's lives. I heard about what happened a while back, and I wanted to talk to you if that's okay." The man hesitated. He wasn't used to interviews. "I don't really talk to cameras much," he said with a small smile. The young man laughed nervously. "That's okay. I'm not from any news channel or anything. It's just for my class. I'm trying to show how one moment can change people." He thought for a second, then nodded. "All right, let's talk." They sat down on a bench outside under the shade of a big oak tree. The young man turned on the small camera, his hands shaking a little. "You don't have to say anything fancy," he said. "Just tell me what you learned from that experience." The man smiled faintly. "Well, I learned that people are quick to judge, but they're also capable of learning. That day taught me patience, sure, but it also reminded me that kindness can ripple farther than we think." The young man listened closely. "Did it change you?" "Yeah," he said softly. "It made me more grateful. You can't control what others do, but you can always control yourself. That's something I wish more people understood." The young man nodded thoughtfully. "Do you ever think about them? The couple?" He paused, glancing at the lake in the distance. "Sometimes, but not with anger. I think about how far they've come too. I see them around now and then, volunteering, helping others. I guess we all learned something that day." The young man smiled. "That's actually really inspiring." When the interview ended, the student thanked him again. "You've got a good story," he said. "Not because it went viral, but because it ended right." The man laughed softly. "That's rare these days." A week later, the young man's project was shown at a local high school event. The short video didn't just focus on the conflict. It told the story of growth, forgiveness, and the quiet ways people can change. The teachers and students applauded. Some even admitted it made them think differently about how they treat strangers. Word about the video spread through town, not as gossip, but as something that made people proud. It reminded them that they were part of a community that could grow, forgive, and move forward. At the same time, the couple continued their quiet work at the community center. They weren't doing it for redemption anymore. They did it because it made them feel connected. Every box they packed, every meal they served, felt like a small way of giving back what they had once taken for granted. One afternoon, as the couple were helping set up tables for a fundraiser, the coordinator approached them. "Hey," she said, "that student documentary about the kindness story? It's being shown at the library tonight. You two should come." They exchanged a glance. The man hesitated. "Do you think we should?" The woman nodded slowly. "Maybe it's time." That evening, the small library hall filled with people from the town. The lights dimmed, and the screen flickered on. The documentary began with soft piano music and clips of the lake, the grocery store, and the familiar parking lot. Then came the interview with the man, the officer who had shown up that day, and even a few townspeople. They all spoke about how something small had taught them patience and respect. When the video ended, the audience clapped quietly, the sound filled with warmth rather than noise. Afterward, the man in the truck stood near the back, smiling humbly as people thanked him. That's when he noticed the couple walking toward him. They didn't look ashamed anymore. They looked at peace. The woman smiled. "It was a beautiful film," he nodded. "It was," the man added. "You said something in there that stuck with me, and about how we can't always choose what happens, but we can choose how we respond. I've been thinking about that a lot." He smiled kindly. "That's the only thing any of us can control." They all stood in silence for a moment, the kind that doesn't need words. Later, the coordinator came over carrying 3 cups of coffee. "You three," she said with a grin, "should be proud. This town's a little better because of what happened, because you didn't let anger win." The man in the truck smiled softly. "I think we all just learned something the hard way." After the event, he walked home under the night sky. The air was cool, and the moonlight cast long shadows across the quiet streets. He thought about how different everything felt now. That day in the parking lot used to weigh heavy in his memory. Now it just felt like a page in a story, a hard chapter, but one that ended right. The next morning, he drove out to the lake again. The water was calm, the surface glinting with sunlight. As he sat by the shore, a small group of kids were fishing nearby, laughing as they tried to untangle their lines. One of them waved at him, and he waved back. It was simple, peaceful, and in that quiet simplicity he found something important. Life wasn't about avoiding conflict altogether. It was about choosing how to rise above it. He pulled a small notepad from his jacket, something he carried when thoughts came to him. He wrote down a few words, almost like a note to himself. Anger fades. Understanding lasts longer. Forgiveness gives peace to both sides. He tore the page out, folded it, and slipped it into his pocket. Later that week, the community center asked him to speak again, this time to a group of adults who had gathered for a local awareness event. He hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. When he stood at the front of the room, he didn't use fancy words or quotes. He just told his story in his own way, honest, humble, and real. "I'm not here because I did something special," he said. "I'm here because I stayed calm on a day when everything told me not to. I didn't do it for attention. I did it because I learned that peace starts with one choice, yours." People listened closely. Some nodded. Some wiped tears quietly. He continued, "We can't control what people say about us, but we can control whether we let their hate become ours. The world doesn't need more noise, and it needs more calm, more patience, more understanding." When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment before breaking into applause. But he didn't smile for the praise. He smiled because he saw something in their faces. Understanding. After the talk, several people came up to him, thanking him for his words. One woman said, "You made me realize I've been holding a grudge for too long. Maybe it's time I let it go." He smiled softly. "That's a good start." Outside, as he was leaving, he noticed the couple again. They had come to listen, quietly sitting in the back. The man approached him holding something small, a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something down," he said, handing it over. The man opened it. It said, "We can't undo what we did, but we can make sure we never do it again. Thank you for showing us the way." He looked up, smiling. "You already have." They nodded, and for the first time since that day, all 3 of them laughed, not out of awkwardness, but genuine warmth. Months later, The town's annual community festival returned. People gathered downtown, enjoying food, music, and laughter. The man in the truck volunteered to help at a booth that collected donations for veterans. Across the street, the couple ran a stand for local families in need. It was just another day, but it felt special. The air carried a quiet sense of connection, a reminder of how far everyone had come. At sunset, as the festival wound down, the man walked past the familiar grocery store parking lot. The plaque was still there, shining in the golden light. Kindness begins where judgment ends. He stood there for a long moment, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Then he took off his cap, smiled, and whispered softly, "That's all it ever needed to be." He turned and walked away, steady, calm, and free. The story that had once begun with anger had ended with peace, not because anyone forced it, but because people had chosen it. And in that quiet town, among the laughter of families and the hum of everyday life, the memory of that lesson lived on, in the way people greeted each other, in the patience shown in checkout lines, and in the gentle reminders that kindness wasn't a reaction. It was a decision. The man drove home that evening with the windows down, the soft breeze brushing through the car. He thought about how strange life was, how one small moment, one wrong encounter, had unfolded into something so much bigger, something good. When he pulled into his driveway, the porch light flicked on automatically. He sat there for a while before getting out. Looking up at the stars above, he smiled, thinking of all that had happened, then whispered to himself it was worth it. Inside, he made himself a cup of tea, sat on the couch, and turned on the TV. The news was running a new story, this time about a group of volunteers rebuilding a playground. Among them were the couple, smiling and working side by side. He couldn't help but smile wider. Maybe he'd stop by and help next time. Because sometimes, the best way to keep kindness alive is to keep showing up, quietly, humbly, and with heart, and so he did. Not as a hero, not as a victim, just as a man who believed in doing the right thing, even when no one was watching.